In the harsh terrain surrounding the mining settlement of Crete, Colorado, 18-year-old Adeline Finch measured her days not by sunrises, but by the spaces between her father's rages. Their cabin, built from rough-hewn timber and weathered by mountain winds, stood isolated against the endless backdrop of stone and sky, a prison disguised as a home. Silas Finch had come to Colorado with dreams of gold running through his veins like fever. Each morning he trudged to his claim with renewed hope, and each evening he returned with empty pockets and a fury that needed somewhere to land. That somewhere was always his daughter. Adeline had learned the geography of survival, which floorboards creaked, when to clear his plate before dissatisfaction curdled into violence, how to become invisible when his shadow darkened the doorway. She moved through their small space like smoke, her spirit a stubborn ember, refusing to be extinguished despite the constant downpour of cruelty. The beatings came for anything: dust on the floor, thin stew, the simple fact of her existence. But it was in the spaces between violence that Adeline found her sanctuary. She would watch hawks circling on thermal currents, their freedom an ache in her chest. They were everything she was not: untethered, powerful, masters of their own sky. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard lay her only treasure, a smooth gray river stone, worn oval by currents she could no longer remember. It was her mother's, the last remnant of a woman whose face had become dreamlike, but whose gentle touch still lived in the cool weight of the stone. In her darkest moments, clutching that stone beneath her threadbare blanket, Adeline didn't dream of rescue or comfort. She dreamed only of the profound peace of oblivion. The mining company's recent troubles cast longer shadows over their already dark existence. Claims were being abandoned, miners let go, and desperation hung over Crete like smoke from poorly tended fires. Silas returned each day more defeated, more dangerous, his silence more menacing than his shouts. Adeline watched the signs with the practiced eye of a creature who'd learned to read the weather of violence. The way he gripped his cup too tightly, the vacant stare that replaced his usual simmering anger, the smell of cheaper whiskey growing sharper on his breath. Something was building, something final and terrible, and she felt it in her bones like the approach of a killing frost. On quiet evenings, when the mountain wind howled through the canyons, she would trace her mother's stone and wonder if somewhere beyond these peaks lay a world where daughters were cherished instead of beaten, where homes held laughter instead of fear. But those were dangerous thoughts, the kind that could weaken her carefully constructed invisibility. The other miners, wives in town, looked at her with pity that felt like acid on her skin. They saw the bruises, the way she flinched at sudden movements, but their whispered sympathies carried no power to change anything. In a place where men ruled absolutely, and the law was as distant as the territorial capital, a daughter's suffering was considered a private, family matter. Yet something deep within Adeline refused to accept that this was all there would ever be. Perhaps it was her mother's blood, or perhaps it was simply the unbreakable will to live that exists in all wild things. She began to notice details about the land around their cabin, the patterns of wildlife, the signs of weather, the secret paths worn by deer and elk. Without knowing why, she was preparing herself for something she couldn't yet name Dodd, as autumn settled over the mountains with its promise of harsh winter ahead. Adeline felt a change coming as surely as she could feel the shift in the wind. The careful balance that had kept her alive for 18 years was about to shatter, and when it did, she would have to choose between the familiar darkness of submission and the terrifying unknown of freedom. Part 2. The final breaking. The end came on an afternoon when the western sky bled purple and orange, as if the heavens themselves bore wounds. Silas returned not with his usual simmering rage, but with something far more dangerous, a terrible, vacant stillness that made the air in the cabin thick and charged with finality. The mining company had finally let him go. His last claim had been sold to pay debts. His final hope of fortune turned to dust. The whiskey on his breath was sharper now, cheaper, and despair clung to him like a burial shroud. He entered without a word, his silence more menacing than any shout. Adeline felt the change immediately. This wasn't the familiar pattern of building anger. This was something else entirely. As he turned to face her, she saw that the man who had been her father was gone, replaced by something utterly broken and determined to break. The last thing over which he held any power. His hand rose with deliberate slowness. And in that moment, Adeline understood with chilling certainty that this wasn't punishment. It was erasure. The animal instinct to live, long buried under years of forced submission, suddenly ignited within her like wildfire. She launched herself from her stool, a cry tearing from her throat as she bolted for the door. The wood splintered against her shoulder as she threw her weight against it, bursting into the frigid night air. The shock of cold was a baptism that cleared the terror from her mind, and she ran without looking back. Behind her, her name was roared into the wind, a sound that had once meant command, but now was nothing more than the desperate bellow of a tyrant losing his only subject. She ran from the malevolent yellow light spilling from the cabin windows, from the sound of boots on the porch, from 18 years of accumulated fear and pain. The landscape transformed under starlight into something both beautiful and terrifying. Towering rock formations became silent giants, and gnarled pines whispered secrets on the wind. For the first time, she was truly alone in this wilderness, not observing it from the confines of the cabin, but part of it, as wild and untamed as any creature that called these mountains home. Every ragged breath was her own. Every aching muscle was a testament to her will to survive. The blood from a cut on her forehead, where a thrown cup had grazed her earlier, felt less like a wound and more like war paint. She was no longer a ghost haunting a dusty cabin. She was a living, breathing creature fleeing for her life. As she climbed higher into the rocky hills, following deer paths and dry creek beds, the familiar landmarks of her oppressive world vanished behind her. The cold bit through her thin dress, and sharp stones cut her feet, but she felt none of it. Her world had shrunk to the burning in her lungs and the singular need to put distance between her past and whatever future awaited. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes' time had lost all meaning in her desperate flight. Finally, exhaustion forced her to stop behind a curtain of ancient junipers. As she leaned against the cold stone, her body trembling uncontrollably, her fingers found something carved into the rock face. They were deliberate notches, weathered by countless seasons, made by human hands. Below them, tied to a bushroot with dried sinew, hung a small bundle of hawk feathers. It was a marker, a sign that this land held secrets and stories she had never known. She was not the first person to seek refuge in these hills. The discovery sent a strange calm through her. Her suffering, which had felt as vast as the sky, was but one small story in a land that held countless others. She was not the first soul to flee in the darkness, and perhaps she would not be the last, but the strength that had carried her this far was finally spent. The adrenaline that had propelled her up the mountainside ebbed away, leaving her limbs feeling like lead. Her vision blurred, the starlight swimming into hazy ribbons. The ground seemed to rush up to meet her as her legs buckled as consciousness faded. Her last coherent thought was not of her father or the pain, but of the hawk feathers, symbols of the untamed freedom she had always craved. And with that image in her mind, she surrendered to the darkness, her body giving out at last, her spirit suspended between one life and the next. Part 3. Awakening in another world. Consciousness returned slowly, like dawn creeping across the mountains. The first sense to awaken was smell pine smoke, dried herbs, and a clean, earthy aroma that spoke of a world far removed from the stale whiskey and unwashed linen of her past life. Next came touch. She lay on something soft, pine needles covered with the thick, warm pelt of a bison. A gentle, consistent warmth radiated from a contained fire nearby, nothing like the sporadic, angry heat of her father's hearth. Then sound not the violent howl of wind across open plains, but the gentle murmur of a nearby stream. Peaceful as a lullaby, for long moments she kept her eyes closed, convinced she was dreaming, or perhaps in the antechamber to the eternal silence she had once coveted. When she finally found courage to look, she saw him. He sat by the fire with his back to her, mending leather with a bone needle. He was an old man, lean but strong, his long gray hair tied back with a simple strip of hide. When he turned, she saw a face carved from the very canyons around them, a terrain of deep lines and weathered patience. His eyes were dark and piercing, but they held no malice, only the profound stillness of a man who had witnessed 1,000 seasons and was surprised by very little. Terror seized her before understanding could. She tried to scramble backward, but pain shot through her battered muscles. The movement was pathetic, and the man simply watched, making no move to stop or approach her. This simple inaction was more disarming than any word could have been. He allowed her the dignity of her fear, and in doing so, began to dismantle it. The days that followed unfolded in quiet rhythm. A rescuer, whose name she did not know, tended to her with methodical grace. He would leave warm broth and cool water near her sleeping place, then retreat to his own tasks, never watching to see if she ate. He cleaned her wounds and applied poultices of crushed leaves and pungent salves that cooled the fire in her skin. His hands were rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle, impersonal, like a craftsman tending a delicate instrument. Adeline, who had only known care as a prelude to obligation or touch as a precursor to pain, was utterly bewildered. This man asked for nothing, demanded no gratitude, no explanation, no conversation. He simply provided what was necessary for life to continue. As her strength returned and the fog of pain receded, she began to study her sanctuary. It was a hidden camp tucked into an alcove of a secret canyon, almost invisible from above. Everything had its place, a life distilled to its essentials. Tools carved from bone and stone, baskets woven from yucca fiber, a small clay pot for cooking. Then she saw it, folded neatly in a corner, a wool blanket whose colors were faded by time and sun, but whose pattern was unmistakable. Interlocking diamonds woven in deep indigo blue and warm ochre. The sight was like a key turning in a long-locked room of memory. A fragment surfaced, hazy and dreamlike, her mother, young and unlined by sorrow, wrapping that very pattern around Adeline's small shoulders, humming a song without words. The memory was so vivid it stole her breath. This place, this man, was somehow connected not just to her survival, but to the only source of pure love she had ever known. One evening, as the last light painted the canyon walls in strokes of fire, the old man approached her with purpose. He looked at her with those dark eyes that seemed to see not just the girl huddled in furs, but the flickering spirit within. He knelt and placed 2 items on the flat rock before her. The first was a wooden bowl steaming with fragrant, nourishing stew. The second was a small leather pouch tied with sinew string. He opened it slightly, revealing dried pale roots and petals. Adeline, who had observed the plants of the high desert her whole life, knew the pouch contained sleep from which there was no waking. The old man said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. He had mended her body, but the choice to truly live, to inhabit it once more, was hers alone. He would not force her to stay or tether a spirit that wished to be free. The choice was between the bowl and the pouch life or the oblivion she had once desperately craved. Her gaze lingered on the leather pouch. It represented an end to memory, to the scars lining her back and the fear etched on her soul. But when she looked at the steaming bowl, she saw more than broth. She saw patient hands that had gathered the ingredients, the quiet fire that had warmed it, the profound belief that her life was worth saving. A slow, determined fire ignited in her chest. With a hand that trembled only slightly, she reached past the pouch and took the bowl. Each sip was a declaration that she would not be erased, an oath that Silas Finch would not have the final victory. She was choosing to live. Part 4. Learning the language of the land. From that moment, everything changed. Her healing was no longer passive, but became an active process of learning to inhabit the world. The old man Kenai, as she learned his name, became her silent tutor. The wilderness, once a terrifying void, transformed into a living classroom where every sound and shadow held meaning. Kenai never lectured or explained. He simply did, expecting her to watch, learn, and replicate. He showed her how to find water not by looking for streams, but by watching the flight paths of finches at dusk. He taught her to distinguish the silver-green leaves of yarrow, whose juice could close a wound, from the nearly identical leaves of a plant that brought only fever. She learned to move not like a frightened girl crashing through undergrowth, but with the quiet, deliberate steps of a hunter, placing her feet to avoid snapping even a single twig. Her hands, once raw from lye soap and scrubbing, grew calloused from different work, grinding acorns into flour, stripping sinew to make cordage. Mastering the patient art of coaxing flame from a firebow, there were no words of praise or encouraging smiles. Kenai's approval came in subtler forms, a quiet nod when she identified the right plant, or the simple act of leaving a more complex task for her to complete in his absence. These small gestures of trust were more valuable than any applause, building blocks of a new self-defined, not by suffering, but by growing competence. The first true test came as the seasons began to turn. The small stream, trickling through their canyon, the lifeblood of their sanctuary, began to change. The water level dropped, and a faint metallic bitterness tainted its taste. The water-loving birds that normally chattered along its banks grew silent and disappeared. Kenai grew troubled, his calm demeanor replaced by deep concern. His experience told him the source must be a blockage high in the canyon, a dangerous climb for his old bones. As he gathered ropes and prepared for the ascent, Adeline felt familiar anxiety prickle, the hypervigilance that had been her constant companion in her father's cabin. She walked the banks of the dying stream, scanning not for the obvious, but for subtle signs of wrongness. It was a skill honed by years of reading her father's moods from the slightest shift in posture or tone. She noticed what Kenai had missed, a thin, whitish film clinging to rocks, downstream and yellowing willow roots near the water's edge. Memory stirred of a small rock slide in a side ravine weeks before, an event she had barely noted. Now intuition screamed that the events were connected. Gathering courage, she touched Kenai's arm to stop his preparations. Using a stick to draw in the dirt, she sketched the canyon, the stream, and the location of the slide, then pointed to her tongue. Mimicking a bitter taste, he watched, expression unreadable, then followed as she led him to the narrow ravine. The air was heavy with sulfur smell, and there was the source. The slide had sheared away hillside, exposing a raw vein of pale yellow ore. Rainwater seeping over this deposit carried poison into the groundwater, feeding their spring. Kenai stood silent for a long time, looking from the poisoned rock to the young woman beside him. He had been seeking a problem of brute force, a dam of fallen trees or wall of mud. She had read the truth in whispers of evidence, a subtle language of decay he had missed. In that moment, their dynamic shifted forever. He was no longer just a savior, and she no longer just a survivor. They were partners. They spent 2 days working together, using fallen logs and packed clay to build a diversion channel, redirecting clean water before it could reach the toxic minerals. It was grueling work, but shared work, a rhythm of effort and purpose that left Adeline feeling more whole than she had ever been. As they returned to camp that evening, Weary but triumphant, peace settled over her. This place was no longer just temporary refuge. It was home she had helped save. But as they stepped into the clearing, that peace was violently shattered. The air was wrong. Her trained eyes immediately saw violations, deep hoofprints in soft earth near the fire pit, and lying half buried in dirt, a dark green bottle bearing the familiar label of cheap whiskey. Cold dread, sharp and sickeningly familiar, washed over her. Their sanctuary was no longer secret. The world of violent, careless men had found her again. Part 5. The poison of the past, the discarded bottle lay like a venomous snake in their sanctuary. Proof that the poison of the world she had fled was not contained but seeped through the land itself. Adeline felt familiar coldness creep through her veins, the icy paralysis of a cornered animal. Kenai's face was grim, his eyes fixed on the hoofprints as if they were a declaration of war. They didn't wait long for battle to arrive. Two men rode into the canyon clearing, their movements clumsy and loud, voices echoing off sacred walls like profanity. They were prospectors, faces burned by sun and coarsened by greed, clothes stained with dirt and cheap whiskey. They moved with careless arrogance of men who believed the world was theirs for the taking. When they saw Kenai, they reined in their horses, expressions shifting to contempt and suspicion. They saw not a man who was part of the land, but an obstacle upon it. They dismounted, spurs jingling, and approached with swaggering intimidation sickeningly familiar to Adeline. Watching from a crevice in the rocks, she felt her breath catch. It was happening again. The same senseless malevolence, the same use of size and threat to dominate. The taller man shoved Kenai's shoulder, a casual act of disrespect meant to test compliance. Kenai stumbled, but didn't fall, his dignity a silent wall against their aggression. The men began taunting him, words streaming slurs and demands, asking about gold, silver veins, convinced he was hiding treasure. Adeline was frozen, trapped in memory of 100 similar moments in the cabin. Her body braced for inevitable violence. Then the second man revealed a terrible truth. Laughing with wheezing unpleasantness, he slapped his thigh and spoke of incredible luck, how they had found this paradise by following a faded, hand-drawn map bought for a pittance in Crete from belongings of a pathetic old miner who had died alone. The man described him with mocking pity, a stubborn drunk who swore this land owed him fortune, who left nothing but a dilapidated cabin and reputation for madness and cruelty. With chilling finality, he mentioned the miner's name, Silas Finch. The name struck Adeline like a physical blow. The world tilted, rocks seeming to close in. It wasn't chance that brought these men here. It was her father's ghost. His obsessive, destructive greed had outlived him, reaching from the grave to lead evil directly to her door. The past wasn't something she could outrun. It was a trail she left behind for others to follow. That realization shattered her paralysis. The ice in her veins didn't melt, but hardened into sharp resolve. This wasn't her father's prison. This was her home, a place she had helped save, where she had chosen life. She would not allow her father's legacy to destroy this too. A desperate plan formed, woven from threads of both her lives. She couldn't fight these men with force, but her father had taught her about cruel men's weaknesses, and Kenai had taught her Earth's secrets. She slipped away from her hiding place, moving with silence Kenai had taught her. Her destination was a shaded patch where innocent-looking white flowers grew. Kenai had once warned her their roots, while not lethal, held the spirit of coyote's bile fast-acting poison that would bring a strong man to his knees with agonizing cramps and confusion. She dug up fleshy roots quickly and precisely, then prepared simple stew with dried meat and ground acorn flour. Into the pot, she grated pale, fibrous roots. Then came the hardest part, transforming herself. She let shoulders slump, wiped dirt on her cheeks, adopted the wide-eyed, vacant stare of a frightened, simple-minded girl. Approaching the prospector's camp, she held out the pot, mumbling it was a gift, a peace offering. The men, bored with tormenting Kenai, turned their attention to her. They saw exactly what she wanted, a half-wit girl, easily intimidated, of no consequence. They laughed, snatching the pot, seeing her offer not as strategy, but as terrified submission they believed was their right. They ate quickly and greedily, guard completely down. The effect was astonishingly fast. Boasting and laughter died, replaced by choked groans. Their faces turned sickly green as poison gripped their insides. Within minutes, they stumbled blindly for their horses, convinced the canyon was cursed, and fled without looking back. Silence returned, absolute and profound. The threat was vanquished not by steel, but by simple root and deep understanding of human cruelty. Adeline stood trembling, empty pot still in her hands. She had protected him, defended their home. But when she turned to Kenai, his expression was one she had never seen: profound. Heart-wrenching sorrow mixed with something that looked almost like fear. He had seen the chilling precision of her actions, the cold fire in her eyes. In a voice barely more than whisper, he spoke words that laid her past bare. What brutal world could teach a child to serve a meal with such quiet and perfect hatred? Part 6. The weight of truth. Kenai's question hung in the quiet air, not as accusation, but as invitation. He had seen the weapon she carried within and was asking her not to justify it, but to lay it down. For the first time in her life, Adeline felt solid ground of safety beneath her feet, a foundation of trust strong enough to bear the weight of her past. The words came not as a steady stream, but as broken fragments, like pieces of a shattered pot she was trying to reassemble. She spoke of silence filled with fear, of a man whose love had twisted into a fist, of endless, suffocating dust of the cabin. Then, her voice softening, she spoke of her mother, a woman barely remembered, and the single vivid memory sparked by the woven blanket. She spoke until words ran out, leaving her hollowed and trembling, not from cold, but from raw, painful release of a lifetime's unshed tears. Kenai listened with stillness that absorbed every word, his face a mask of profound empathy. When she fell silent, he simply nodded as if confirming something long suspected. He rose slowly and disappeared into his rock-sheltered dwelling, returning with hands cupped around a small object. He knelt before her and opened his palms, revealing a small wooden bird, paint faded to palest blue, form-worn smooth by years. He began to speak softly, telling a story from long ago. He spoke of his wife, Laughing Brook, and of a young white woman who sometimes visited their camp, woman with corn silk hair and eyes holding summer sky's kindness. This woman was different from others, looking at his people not with fear or contempt, but with curiosity and respect. She and his wife would trade valuable things, Laughing Brook giving wild healing herbs, the woman bringing needles and thread. The woman had gentle spirit, but deep quiet strength, and one day she came with her newborn daughter. He had carved this small bluebird as a gift for the child. As he spoke, Adeline's world reformed around a new, astonishing center. He was talking about her mother. The gentle hands, forgotten lullabies, the blanket, it was all real. He had known her. His wife had been her mother's friend. This revelation was seismic shift in her soul's landscape. Her rescue hadn't been random kindness from a stranger. It was the closing of a sacred circle, a debt of friendship repaid across a generation. She wasn't an outsider who had stumbled into sanctuary. She was, in ways she could never have imagined, coming home. The bond between them, already forged in crisis and quiet understanding, was now sealed by grace of shared history. The days that followed were time of deep, restorative peace. Fear that had been Adeline's constant shadow finally receded, chased away by warmth of newfound kinship. They worked together in effortless harmony. She learned Cherokee names for stars he pointed out with gnarled finger, and she told him stories her schoolteacher had once shared about the same constellations. Two different languages for the same sky, and they found quiet joy in sharing. Her laughter, once a sound she thought lost forever, began to return. At first quiet and rusty, but soon genuine expression of a spirit remembering how to be light. Kenai, for his part, found in her balm for long years of solitude. She was the daughter he never had, living echo of kindness his wife had found in a friend from another world. Their life fell into gentle, healing rhythm dictated by sun and seasons. The canyon, once place of refuge, was now true home, its walls holding not just safety, but promise of future. Adeline began to believe she might live out her days in this hidden peace, that the violent, grasping world of men like her father could never touch them. Here she had found her place. Small pocket of existence where scars were not source of shame, but testament to strength, that brought her to this point of grace. She felt belonging so profound it was almost painful, a fragile, beautiful thing she guarded with every fiber of her being. But the world of straight lines and sharp steel has little respect for circles. Peace was broken on a crisp autumn afternoon, not by drunken shouts, but by clean, decisive crunch of heavy boots on gravel. A man appeared at their canyon's entrance alone, but representing force more powerful than any band of prospectors. He wore crisp, clean uniform and carried a surveyor's transit over his shoulder. He was polite, voice devoid of emotion, as he addressed Kenai and unrolled a map-stark white page covered in grit of black, lines carving mountains and streams into neat, soulless squares. He informed them with cold, unassailable authority of government decree that this land had been officially annexed, charted, and sectioned for settlement. Their canyon, their home, their sacred space was now designated as Lot 73. According to the paper he held, they were trespassing. Part 7. The bridge builder. The surveyor's words hung in the air long after he departed. Invisible fence caging them in. The map he had displayed was more than paper and ink. It was a weapon that could dismantle their world without firing a shot. In the face of this sterile violence, Kenai's posture seemed to shrink, showing not anger or fear, but something far more heartbreaking, profound. Bone-deep weariness. It was resignation of a man witnessing the final chapter of a story he had seen unfold his entire life, his people systematically erased. Not always with bullets, but with lines on pages and laws written in a language that had no words for what was being lost. He looked at ancient canyon walls, not as a homeowner viewing property, but as a man preparing to say goodbye to his oldest friend. But Adeline was not weary. She was incandescent with rage so pure and protective it felt like physical force inside her. She had not survived her father's fists only to be defeated by paper. She had not chosen life in this canyon only to have it stolen by distant government and numbered lots. The timid girl who had fled into the night was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned to fight with fierce, unyielding tenacity of wildflowers growing through rock. To fight an enemy, one must first know its name. Kenai, spurred by fire in Adeline's spirit, agreed they needed to learn more. He disappeared for a day, melting into landscape to seek scattered remnants of his people families living in hidden mountain folds, forever moving to stay ahead of encroaching lines on surveyors' maps. He returned at dusk with grim news. The land had been purchased, not by soldiers or violent land grabbers, but by something more insidious, a development company attracting settlers with promises of a progressive, peaceful community. It was to be called Harmony Creek, built on principles of respect and fairness. The family leading this venture was named Fairchild Quakers. By all accounts, good people who treated natives they employed with unusual kindness. This revelation was a disorienting blow. How do you fight an enemy who's not evil? How do you stand against progress when it wears the mask of benevolence? Adeline was plunged into moral wilderness, A conflict not between right and wrong, but between two different rights. She spent the entire night staring into fire's embers, the terrible paradox turning over in her mind. She looked at Kenai, asleep under his furs, and saw decades of quiet dignity and unspoken loss in his peaceful face. She knew he could not win this fight. His voice was silent to the world of deeds and laws. He was a relic they would politely sweep aside. But she was not. She was a white woman whose voice, however small and trembling, was one they might be compelled to hear. The thought of returning to that world, walking into a town filled with the same kind of men who populated her nightmares, was terror that threatened to swallow her whole. But as first pale light touched the canyon rim, her decision was made. The greatest courage is not facing a monster you know you can defeat, but walking willingly into darkness armed with nothing but a sliver of hope. To save her home, she had to leave it. To protect Kenai, she had to face the world that had tried to destroy her. The next morning she stood before Kenai not as a frightened girl, but as a reluctant warrior. She had bundled provisions in the faded blanket that once belonged to her mother, her face pale but eyes holding steady, determined light. She explained her plan in a low, firm voice. She would go to nearby town of Silverton, learn where to find this Fairchild family, and stand before them not as a beggar, but as a witness. She would tell them the story of the man and land their good intentions were about to destroy. Then, without a tear, she turned and walked toward the canyon's mouth, her small figure outlined against the vast, unforgiving expanse of the world she now had to face alone. The journey to Silverton was descent into a world she had forgotten. Pure silent air of high country gave way to thick, dust-laden atmosphere of a town built on excavation and relentless ambition. After the subtle living language of the canyon, the town was chaotic roar of shouting men, clanging hammers, and rumble of ore carts. For the first hours, she was the ghost of the cabin all over again, making herself small, avoiding eye contact, her hard-won confidence threatening to crumble under weight of so many careless, judging eyes. But then she felt the faint outline of the carved bluebird through cloth of her bundle, solid reminder of her purpose. She was not fleeing this world anymore. She was confronting it as ambassador for a kingdom of silence and stone. Finding the Fairchild land office was easy. It was the newest, proudest building on Main Street. Its polished windows and freshly painted sign a bold declaration of the future it intended to build. Standing before it, Adeline's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the fortress of the man who held her world on paper. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was quiet and orderly, stark contrast to chaos outside. A man at a large oak desk looked up older, with neatly trimmed gray beard and face that, to her surprise, was gentle and thoughtful. There was none of the predatory sharpness she associated with powerful men. This was Thomas Fairchild, and his calm, quiet demeanor was more disarming than any show of aggression would have been. He invited her to sit, voice even and kind, asking what business a young woman could have with his company. For a moment old fear seized her, threatening to steal her voice. But then she looked into his eyes and saw not a tyrant but a man of conviction. She realized the legal argument would be useless. She had no deed, no title, no right he would recognize. The only thing she had was truth. So she did not argue. She told a story. Part 8. The circle complete her voice. At first a hesitant whisper grew stronger as she spoke. Adeline described a hidden canyon not as attractive land but as a living place, sanctuary where life's rhythm was still tied to sun and seasons. She described an old man not as trespasser but as its rightful guardian, a man whose knowledge was written not in books but in hawk's flight and turning of leaves. She spoke of his silent kindness, of the life he had saved, of profound peace that existed in that small corner of the world. She made Thomas Fairchild see Kenai not as a problem to be solved, but as a man whose existence was a sacred text her listener was about to burn without ever having read. When her story was finished, deep silence filled the office. Fairchild looked at her with unreadable expression, but absolute attention. Adeline knew her words had moved him, but that they were not enough. Words were air. He dealt in property, in lines on maps. So she reached into her bundle, her hand closing around the warm, smooth wood of the bluebird. With quiet reverence, she placed it on the polished surface of his desk. The small faded toy looked impossibly fragile and profoundly ancient in that modern office. "He carved this," she said softly, "more than 18 years ago. It was a gift for the infant daughter of a white woman who was a friend to his wife." She paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. "That woman was my mother. I was that child." The small bird sat between them, no longer just a toy but a bridge across time, a testament to forgotten history of peace and friendship. It was undeniable physical proof that the lines between their worlds were not as sharp as the ones on his map. Thomas Fairchild stared at the bluebird, then at Adeline, and the conviction in his own eyes began to waver, replaced by a look of deep, troubled contemplation. He was a Quaker, a man who had built his life and fortune on a foundation of principle. He had come west to build a community of harmony, and this young woman with her small, powerful totem had just shown him that his first act would be one of profound disharmony. He saw the canyon now not as Lot 73, but as the home of a man whose wife had shown kindness to one of his own people. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, he slowly rolled up the large map that lay on his desk. "The boundaries of Harmony Creek," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "will not be drawn through a good man's home. The canyon will be left in peace." Adeline felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She had won. But just as she prepared to give her thanks and leave, Fairchild stopped her. He looked at her with new intensity, a look of profound respect and dawning realization. "You speak the language of two worlds," he said. "I came here to build a bridge between them, but I see now that I do not know how. You do." He then made her an offer that shook her to her core. He asked her to stay. He offered her a home, a respected position, and a purpose, to work as a healer and mediator for the new settlement, to ensure that the story of Kenai would be the last of its kind. The offer hung in the air, a crossroads presented by fate. She had just won back her silence and solitude, and now she was being asked to step into the very center of the storm. Not as a victim, but as a leader. Adeline looked at the kind, hopeful face of Thomas Fairchild, and then in her mind's eye, she saw the weary, resigned face of Kenai. She saw the chasm between their two worlds, a canyon of mistrust and misunderstanding carved by generations of conflict. To return to the safety of her canyon would be to turn her back on the man who had taught her what true strength was. It would be to preserve her own peace at the expense of a greater one. In that moment, she understood the final lesson Kenai had been teaching her all along, that survival is for the self, but a life of purpose is for others. With a quiet nod, she accepted. She would be the bridge. Years passed. The raw, unsettled land of the San Juan Mountains slowly yielded to the community of Harmony Creek. It was not the perfect utopia Thomas Fairchild had dreamed of, for no place built by human hands ever is. But it was different, a place where the fences were a little lower, where the Ute and Apache families who had lived there for centuries were treated not as ghosts, but as neighbors. At the heart of that fragile peace was Adeline. She never held an official title, but was known simply as the healer or the bridge woman. Her home was a small cabin on the edge of settlement, itself a bridge between the tidy grid of the town and the untamed wilderness that surrounded it. Her garden was a tapestry of two worlds, with orderly rows of settlers' vegetables growing alongside wild, potent herbs Kenai had taught her to identify. People of all kinds found their way to her door. Mother, whose child was consumed by fever. A farmer locked in bitter water dispute with a native family. A young Ute man struggling to find his place in a changing world. To each she offered not just remedies, but deep, non-judgmental listening that seemed to soothe the very soul. On a warm evening in late summer, Adeline made the familiar journey back to her canyon. The path was a welcome friend, each turn and stone part of her own story. The canyon was just as she had left it, a timeless sanctuary, an anchor of silence in her often tumultuous life. Kenai was much older now, his body frail but his spirit as clear and bright as ever. They sat by the fire in comfortable silence, a language richer than any words. He watched her with deep pride shining in his dark eyes. Seeing the woman she had become calm, confident. Her scars no longer wounds, but beautiful, intricate lines on a map of a life well lived. He told her he had one last gift. From an old leather bag, he retrieved a small, intricately beaded medicine bundle. It was ancient and radiated quiet power. He explained that it had belonged to his wife, Laughing Brook. She was a bridge woman too, he said softly. She believed that one day a healer would come to this valley, a child born of two worlds, one of great pain from your people and one of great kindness from mine. She said this child would have the strength to weave the torn pieces of our worlds back together. He then revealed the final, astonishing truth. Adeline's mother had been more than just a friend to his wife. She had been her devoted student, learning the Apache way of healing, of listening to the plants and understanding the balance of spirit. His wife had been preparing this very medicine bundle for her, believing she might be the one to fulfill the prophecy. But when Silas, Finch had dragged his wife away into isolation and cruelty, the circle was broken. My wife's spirit waited, Kenai said, placing the bundle in Adeline's hands. And when I found you, broken at the edge of the rocks, I knew it had not been wrong. It had only been patient. Adeline looked down at the bundle, the threads of her life finally weaving together into a single, breathtaking tapestry. Her pain, her flight, her rescue, her purpose. It was not a series of accidents, but a destiny, a legacy of healing passed down from a friendship between two women. Her entire life, even the darkest parts, had been the forging of the perfect instrument for this sacred work. She was not just a survivor. She was the answer to a prayer. The narrator would say that Adeline Finch's name was never carved onto a grand monument, but her legacy was written in the quiet endurance of a community. She never married, finding her great love not in a single person, but in the family she built from the desperate. Souls of Harmony Creek, her redemption, was not a gift she was given, but a treasure she forged from the ashes of her own suffering. Her destiny, set in motion by the compassion of a widowed Apache, was not to be tied to a new life, but to be fundamentally and purposefully free. For true freedom, she had learned, is not the absence of bonds, but the strength to choose the bonds that heal the world.